So we've been discussing sediments by location. Neritic, again, are near the shore. Pelagic are on the deep ocean floor. We talked about turbidites and turbidity currents. The remainder of the pelagic sediments, one of them is clays. Now, we don't have a nice picture here. This is the most easily transported terrigenous sediment, so it can go the farthest out into the deep ocean. And so we find a lot of clay at the bottom of the deep ocean. And we'll look at a map in a little bit about distribution and talk about why clays dominate some places and other sediments dominate in others. But what brings clays out to the deep ocean floor is primarily wind and some of the currents. And remember, the clay particles, once they're in the water, can go a really long distance. The water has to pretty much stop moving before the clay particles will be able to settle out. The other pelagic sediment that is of note are the oozes. Now, we've already mentioned biogenous sediments that are made out of microscopic organisms. So I included this picture again just as a reminder. We have two types of oozes at the bottom of the ocean floor, or in the deep ocean realm. We have the calcareous oozes that are made of things like foraminifera and coccolithophores. That's these two things on top. They are made of calcium carbonate. The siliceous oozes are made of things like radiolarians on the left and diatoms on the lower right. And they are dominant. You'll notice here we have some term called the CCD. So let's talk a little bit about that and what's going on the ocean floor. The ocean is quite deep, so it's up to 2 miles. It's on average 2 miles down to the deep ocean floor. So the pelagic sediments have to get down there. If we look at these organisms, most of them live near the surface. So the coccolithophores on the upper right, the diatoms on the lower right are both photosynthetic organisms. They are basically the bottom of the food chain. They are the things that create food that other organisms can eat. The forams and the radiolarians need something to eat, so they have to live near where the diatoms where the diatoms and the coccolithophores live. So what that means is that these organisms, generally speaking, live in the very uppermost part of the ocean. They are floaters. They kind of move around with the currents. When they die, that is when their shells sink to the ocean floor. So as we look at this picture, that thin little line at the top really represents the upper part of the ocean where there's enough light for photosynthesis, and that's where these organisms live. When they die, they sink to the bottom, and we're going to learn more about ocean chemistry later on in the semester. But what you should know is that as you get deeper into the ocean, the water gets colder. And as it gets colder, it also has a lower oxygen content. Photosynthesis provides oxygen to the top part of the ocean. But to get to the bottom of the ocean, it's got to be circulated down there by currents. The critters that live in the deeper part of the ocean use oxygen and they give off carbon dioxide. And so what we find in the deeper part of the ocean is a higher concentration of carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide reacts with the water to create carbonic acid. And it turns out that these shells on the top here, the ones created by the forams and the coccolithophores and other organisms that use calcium carbonate for their shells, calcium carbonate reacts with acid and dissolves. Silicon dioxide, which is what the shells at the bottom here are made of, does not react with acid, and so it is stable in an acidic water environment, whereas the shells on top here are not. So what does that mean? What that means is when the water is cold enough and deep enough and has a high enough concentration of carbon dioxide, it is acidic enough to dissolve the calcium carbonate shells. So the shells you see on top here, when they get into that really deep water that is acidic, they will dissolve. The depth at which they all dissolve, they're all gone, is called the calcium carbonate compensation depth, or CCD. Once you get below the CCD, you will not find calcium carbonate shells creating ooze on the bottom of the deep ocean floor. So you can see if the water is shallow enough, if we're above the CCD, we will accumulate those calcium carbonate shells. If we're below the CCD, we will not, because they will dissolve. So think of these organisms living in the upper part of the ocean. They die. There's essentially a rain of shells, microscopic shells, falling to the ocean floor, making ooze. As long as we are above the CCD, the ooze will be calcareous ooze, because these organisms that use calcium carbonate for their shells are much more abundant than the organisms that use silicon dioxide for their shells. So if you rain all these down on the ocean floor, there will be these shells mixed in, but the ones on top here, the calcareous shells, will dominate. The siliceous shells will be present, but they're just a small percentage. If you get below the CCD, those calcareous shells have dissolved, and so the only thing that makes it to this deep part of the ocean is these siliceous shells. And so the siliceous ooze is what we find in the very deep part of the ocean below the CCD, and we find calcareous ooze above it. Long explanation, but that brings us to this map where you can see how this plays out. And again, it's not just depth, it's really about chemistry. So the chemistry determines which kind of ooze you will find. Generally speaking, in deeper parts of the ocean, you will find siliceous ooze. In shallower parts, you can find calcareous, but it's much more complicated than that. So here we see a map of the deep ocean floor and the distribution of different pelagic sediments. And what you'll notice is the blue brick pattern. That's the calcareous ooze. So that's where the water is not too acidic, and so the calcareous sediment can settle out. You'll notice that right along here is where the mid-ocean ridge is in the Pacific. Here's the mid-ocean ridge in the Atlantic, and remember, that's going to be a little bit shallower water. It sits up higher. And in the deeper parts and places where we have the right chemistry, we get siliceous ooze. That's the green pattern. And then in some places, we don't get either kinds of ooze. We actually get clay, the pelagic clay. Remember, this is going to be from dust and ash that is blown off the land. That's a terrigenous sediment. That's this gray color. And then the land-derived sediments, really what they're referring to is terrigenous sediments like turbidites and things like that. That's the orange pattern. And you can see that dominates in places where we have some big rivers emptying into the ocean. Up here, it could be partly due to the volcanic activity, as well as the mountain range growing up and shedding a lot of sediments. So there's a variety of reasons why you would get what they call land-derived sediments, but the pelagic clays are land-derived as well, so that's a little misleading. I think what they're trying to say is these are maybe a little coarser sediments, things especially like turbidites. And you can see that like in the Gulf of Mexico, we get turbidites. And then you've got the continental shelf deposits, which of course are primarily terrigenous, although there could be some things like coral reefs and stuff there as well. So that's our sediment distribution. The last thing that we want to cover is just how we collect the sediment. So how do we know what's down there? We've got a number of ways to do it. They show you this clamshell sampler. We have one of these at the college. It's actually a scary piece of equipment if you see one in person, because when you trip this lever, there's actually a spring that causes the clamshell to close. And as you might imagine, it takes quite a bit of force to dig a chunk of sediment out of the bottom. And so that spring-loaded clamshell clanks shut pretty quickly and pretty hard. They also show you a piston core. This would allow you to take a sample of several feet of ocean sediment at the bottom of the ocean floor. It's kind of a quick and easy way to do it. You drop the line triggers the core. You can see it slides into that loose sediment, and then as you pull it up, it seals the top, and so the sediment can't slide out the bottom. If we want to go even deeper into the ocean floor, we're going to have to switch over to the deep ocean drilling rig, which we talked about earlier in the semester. You can see the construction on the left, what the rig actually looks like, and on the right, it kind of shows you and gives you an impression of the technological difficulty of doing this. So the pipe that comes out of that drill rig has to go down 2 miles before it hits the ocean floor. And that means that the ship has to stay in exactly the same place as that core is drilled. That said, they can drill down through 1,000 or more feet of sediment using this drill rig. So it's a pretty cool piece of equipment. The last thing I want to mention is that over time, all of these sediments that we've discussed can be turned into sedimentary rock. And the process is burial under additional sediments. That burial results in compaction, and the water moving through the sediments can leave some minerals behind, which will cement those sediments together. So compaction and cementation. This ultimately gives us rock, sedimentary rock like you see in the background. And those white cliffs, which we find in Great Britain on the south coast of England along the English Channel, those are completely composed of what we would call chalk. But if we looked at them very closely under a microscope, this little picture in the upper right-hand corner, those tiny little microscopic shell pieces from the outside of a coccolithophore is what is making up all of this sedimentary rock that we see in this picture here. So you can imagine how much sediment, how many shells are in there, and how long it would have taken to accumulate all of those tiny little microscopic shells. And that's it.